So welcome, whether you're in person or you're joining us virtually. We're so excited you're here for our Women's History Month lecture. And it is entitled Rachel's Story, Slavery and Home on a Texas Plantation. Whitney Nell Stewart is a historian of slavery and the American South. Along with several articles and essays, she is the author of This Is Our Home, Slavery and Struggle on Southern Plantations, which recently won the Ramirez Family Award for Most Significant Scholarly Work from the Texas Institute of Letters. Her work has been supported by research and writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian, the George Washington Presidential Library, and the International Center for Thomas Jefferson Studies, among others. She received her PhD from Rice University and is currently an assistant professor of history and faculty of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. Thank you and welcome to TCC Trinity River campus and with our Connect folks online. And thank you for speaking for us.
Thank you all for having me. Thanks so much to Chloe specifically for inviting me. I am really looking forward to talking with you today a bit about Rachel's story. Thank you for coming. And I have been researching for my second book project, which is about the Varner Hogg Plantation. Okay, no, this isn't working. Cool. All right, that'll work. Varner Hogg Plantation, State Historic Site, which is in Brazoria County, Texas, which is just southwest of Houston. This place is absolutely fascinating. It has most of the major turning points and moments of Texas history in its individual history. We have indigenous homeland and displacement. We have the old 300, Austin's first colony. We have Texas Revolution. Santa Anna apparently was kept here after he was captured. Chattel slavery, the Civil War, convict leasing, black cowboys, ranching, oil. And then in the 20th century, it transitions into a state-owned park and museum. And the person who gives the buildings and the land to the state is this woman here. And she has a pretty exceptional name. Her name is Ima Hogg. And yes, that is indeed her name. She is the only daughter of the first Texas-born governor of this state, Jim Hogg. And because of that oil that was found on the site after her father purchased Varner Hogg, she and her brothers became very rich. She helped to found the Houston Symphony. They created, in large part, the neighborhood of River Oaks in Houston. And she also was at the forefront of historic preservation in this state. She created the Bayou Bend collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and of course, gave the land to create Varner Hogg State Historic Site. So I'm interested in the way that she is thinking about history, because when she gives the building and the land to the state, she has a very specific story of Texas that she wants to tell. She wants it to be about the, quote, pioneers of this state. Certain people are left out of this story. Certain people are included in this story. So I wanted to know more about Ima Hogg's conception of Texas history. So I went to the sources. I went to the Briscoe Center at UT a couple weeks ago and started delving into the Ima Hogg papers. There are thousands and thousands of documents to go through. Her writing to various people about the site, about a number of other things as well. But one particular document really stood out to me when I was at the Briscoe Center. And here's a little excerpt of this letter. This letter is being written to Ima Hogg from a woman named Alice Kilman. Alice was hired by Ima Hogg to do research about Varner Hogg Plantation. And Alice Kilman was in the Brazoria County Courthouse looking through records and came across some court cases that were very intriguing about some of the former owners and residents of the plantation. She's speaking here about Columbus Patton, who owned this plantation from the 1830s to the 1850s. His family would continue to own it for about another decade and a half. But she writes to Ima Hogg how she's found out some things about a supposed, quote, disgraceful intimacy that Columbus Patton had with a, quote, a woman named Rachel, who was a slave. Now, this I already knew, but it's the next sentence that really made me stop in my tracks. Alice wrote to Ima, "We don't have to tell the world about that." And that kind of made me stop, because if you actually go into the court case records, it is impossible to leave Rachel out of this story. It's impossible to leave Rachel out of the story of Varner Hogg. And the sources tell us that we have to not only include her, but she must be center of the story of Varner Hogg Plantation when it was, in fact, a working sugar plantation. It's not just the court case records, though, that tell us about Rachel and that show us how important Rachel's story is to the larger story of Varner Hogg, and you can also say of Texas. There is a multitude of corroborating evidence for this court case records. We have narratives from people formerly enslaved at the site. We have additional court cases brought after emancipation, and I have to shout out here John Lundberg, who, thank you, John, who found and sent me this incredible 1870 court case that tells us a lot about who Rachel was. There's also archaeological evidence at Varner Hogg Plantation site. Then there's broader cultural context for which we can understand Rachel's life. This multitude, this diverse source set is imperative if we want to be telling the story of women like Rachel, and if we want to tell the story of enslaved people in the United States. And this kind of source base was really important to me as I was beginning to think about and compile evidence for my book, This Is Our Home, Slavery and Struggle on Southern Plantations. And I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the writings of enslavers and overseers, of the white individuals who we hear and read their words and their perspectives a lot. That is an important part of the source base, but so too are objects that archaeologists and site staff have found, not only in the ground, but hidden in extant buildings. Archaeologists, for instance, at Montpelier Plantation, that central little map there, they're mapping out where artifacts are distributed within a plantation landscape to help us understand how enslaved people are creating their space there. There's architecture and images. There are all kinds of sources that we can bring together to tell the story of slavery and struggle on Southern plantations. So in my book, which I do have a few copies for sale here, always be selling, right? In my book, I argue that enslaved people created and attempted to create a sense of home even within the confines and oppressive circumstances of the institution of slavery. It looks at how the physical and material evidence that's left behind by the actions taken, the homemaking practices of enslaved people, can tell us a lot about how they actually lived through the institution of slavery, one that at its core was about violence and oppression. But yet, even within those circumstances, people still struggled to create a sense of meaning, a sense of family, and a sense of home. So within the book, I focus on 5 different plantations across the American South from the late 18th century to after the Civil War. It starts in Virginia, and like so many enslaved and enslaving Americans themselves did throughout the antebellum era, it moves south and westward. So we start in Virginia, we move to North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and then back to the cradle of the Confederacy, South Carolina. So each chapter not only looks at a different plantation site and the Black and white residents who were living and laboring there, it also seeks to go a little bit deeper and try to understand a particular aspiration of home that enslaved people were attempting to make. So chapter 1 looks at ways that enslaved people literally demarcated spaces of home as apart from spaces where they were forced to labor for their enslavers, in so doing creating a space that could feel more like their own. The second chapter at Stagville Plantation, it looks at 3 particular objects that were found within buildings on the plantation site and explores how those specific objects, including this walking stick here, which was found in the walls of the enslaver's house at Stagville Plantation, but also a cowrie shell and divining rods, how these being embedded within homes were meant to be tools with which to create a sense of protection and privacy. The third chapter looks at how after forced migration, which historians estimate nearly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly migrated from the upper South of Virginia and North Carolina to the deep South of Alabama and Mississippi with the growth of cotton plantations, which was possible only because of the forced removal of Native people. But after that forced migration, how did enslaved people try to create a sense of home? In part through literally burying their people in the ground, rooting themselves in a space. The fourth chapter looks at Patent Place, which is the 19th century term for Varner Hog Plantation. And it charts really the story of Rachel, which we're going to talk about today, and the way that she utilized power and projected a sense of authority, but also how that authority and power was tenuous because, like any enslaved individual, she did not have full control over her life. Yet still, she sought this place, Patent Place, as her home. And lastly, the fifth chapter looks at Red Cliff Plantation in South Carolina and the ways that the firebrand pro-slavery advocate James Henry Hammond shaped the lives of enslaved families on that site, but also how enslaved families created a legacy for future generations through the architecture and their family making. It's really through Patent Place that we find Rachel's story. Her story is very much intertwined with this plantation in Texas. We don't know everything. This is a very common occurrence when we are studying the history of enslaved people and families. But the sources we do have tell us at least the beginnings of her story. They give us pieces of those stories that we can try to link together to create a narrative and to create a sense of who she was. Rachel's story is at once remarkable, but also representative. She had a very unique experience in terms of the history of slavery. Yet her story also is one that was commonplace for enslaved women. So I want us to keep in mind as we are talking about Rachel's story, this two-sided coin of her life. Yes, she was this unique individual who had a different experience than many enslaved women, but at the core of her story is also something that represents what millions of women in the United States were going through. And indeed, millions of enslaved women have their stories that haven't been told yet. Too few of those stories get to be told. Too often, women like Alice Kilman tell us that their stories don't need to be told. I think today we'll see that Rachel is certainly one who can not only tell us about the institution of slavery, but also make clear for us that we need more stories of Black women. I want to take us a little bit through her life as we know it, really again focusing on Patton Place. So what was her life like before she came to Patton Place, the little that we know of it, including her early life in Kentucky and her first connection with Columbus Patton, and then her forced relocation from Kentucky to Texas and making Patton Place her home, the time period that she lived as mistress of the plantation, but then also the fall from position and power that she experiences there. And then lastly, her life after Patton Place. When she's exiled to Ohio, she finds freedom, comes back to Texas, and is re-enslaved. But she does not end her life there. We know that she demands what she feels is owed to her. When her life ends, we don't know the exact date, but we can put a cap on a little bit of her story and ending with the ways that she sought justice and recompense. Now we can get a little bit of a sense of this early life of Rachel from census records. This is from the 1880 census, and you can see here on the right-hand side that she was born, she tells the census record taker that she was born in Kentucky. Unfortunately, the mother and father birthplace is not filled out, so we don't know at least where she believed that her parents were born. But we do know that she is born in Kentucky, and based on her age at this time, 60, we can assume her birth year was around 1820. And I say around because there are other documents that we have that point to an earlier birth year for her. Inventory records suggest potentially she was born in 1814 or 1815. So it's sometime within that 5 to 6 year range that Rachel was born. We don't know too much about what her early life was like. We don't even know necessarily who enslaved her. We have an idea that it might have been A.S. Tyler. He is one of the many men who gives testimony during those court cases that Alice Kilman was looking through. And in one instance, Tyler says that he left Rachel with Columbus in 1833. This language, like so much of the language in these court records, is a little bit fuzzy. Where that was it in Kentucky or Texas? It's probably in Kentucky, but we don't know 100% for sure. But not only does Tyler say that he left Rachel with Columbus in 1833, and this means by the way, that Rachel was around 13 to 19 when she is, quote, left with Columbus Patton, and Columbus was around the age of 21 at the time. And he notes that he saw something, quote, brewing between Rachel and Columbus, even in this very earliest moment of their relationship. In 1833, around that time, maybe the year before, the Patton family, which is an extensive family, there are parents, at least 4 brothers, 2 sisters, move from Kentucky to Texas, which at that time was Mexico. And they bring with them several enslaved laborers. We don't know exactly how many. There are staff at the site that say it could be multiple dozen people. It's at least 3 people based on records that put their birthplace in Kentucky. Rachel is one of them, Jake and Solomon, who are also going to be to show up in records later for Patton Place. So the Pattons and several of their enslaved people, including Rachel, are moving from Kentucky to Texas. And within about a year, Columbus Patton purchases about 4,428 acres from Martin Varner, who received one of the old 300 leagues of land. And with that, the Varner plantation becomes the Patton plantation. And in time, pretty quickly, the Pattons begin to grow their enslaved labor force. Approximately 55 to 65 enslaved people are owned by the Pattons in the 1840s. By 1860, that number will raise into the 80s. They're also changing the landscape of Patton Place. They are beginning to farm, to cultivate sugarcane. They build a sugar mill. They build a slave quarter with several, perhaps more than a dozen cabins. And they actually are crafting the brick with which they are making the sugar mill, the slave cabins, and even the new two-story mansion. They're making this brick themselves. Enslaved people are making this brick by hand using the creek and a nearby Brazos River to do so. You can get a sense here, this is a digital recreation by that's at the Varner Hogg Historic Site. And this is estimated to be about what it would have looked like in 1860. And you can see on this side of the creek, which the blue creek is running right through there, it's called Varner Creek. On this side of the plantation, we can see there was a, they had horses. They also apparently had a horse track at one point. You can see the two-story mansion, a detached kitchen and dining room, and then across the creek is where the real labor for the plantation was taking place. You also have the slave cabins on the left-hand side, that sugar mill right in the middle, and then behind them, the fields of sugarcane. And this was built by enslaved people and potentially some free labor as well during the Patton era. Now, it's in that two-story main house that we're going to see the Pattons operating their business. So the Pattons really operate their business as a kind of family business. They own lots of property jointly together. But at the same time, Columbus Patton is the one who outright owns this place. By 1840, the family had several thousand acres of land that they owned in Texas. And after they were expanding the plantation here at Patton Place, building this mansion, one could call it. I mean, this may not look like much of a mansion in comparison to some of the other grand plantations that you know in Virginia, but for Texas, this was indeed a very impressive house. And it's here that Rachel's story really is going to begin to change, where she is going to begin to exert considerable power and control by the mid-1840s. By this time, the Patton mother and father have passed away. Sisters of Columbus Patton have been married and are gone. And it's that time that we begin to hear talk of how Rachel and Columbus, by the mid-1840s, are living, quote, more like man and wife. Now, this is coming from the lips of a white man and an overseer with whom Rachel apparently had real tension. But it's interesting to note because we have corroborating evidence for this. We'll get to that in a second. Like man and wife is important here because they could not be man and wife. It was illegal for enslaved people to marry, and interracial marriage was illegal in Texas. So they're never actually married in terms of a legal sense of marriage. We have no evidence that they had any children. We do have evidence, though, that some kind of what we can term intimate relationship did develop between Rachel and Columbus. Now, there are lots of questions that we can and should ask regarding consent here. What was Rachel's choice like in this matter? She was an enslaved woman. She did not, in fact, have the ability to give full consent. And so we don't know what she really thought of this intimate relationship. What we do know is that she seemed to take advantage of the small opportunity that this relationship gave her. Now, the fact that she is living almost as a wife in this situation means that she will be, quote, mistress of the plantation. Columbus Patton is a bachelor his entire life. Once his mother is gone and his sisters are gone, a woman is needed to take the position of lady of the household. And it seems that Rachel filled that position. Now, we have this kind of phrasing several times throughout the court cases. And as I mentioned, we do have corroborating evidence for this. This is Sarah Ford, a woman who was born enslaved at Patton Place. She gives an interview with the WPA in 1937. And she told the interviewer that Kit, which was the nickname of Columbus, had an African woman from Kentucky for his wife. And she notes the fact that it was impossible for them to actually be man and wife. She knew this, but that almost didn't matter because Rachel still required other enslaved people on the site to call her, quote, Miss Rachel. So she was able to garner some position on the plantation. But what does it actually mean to be a, quote, mistress of the plantation? Well, in large part, it had to do with labor. It was about managing the labor of others, just like a white woman as head of this household would have. So Grimm notes that she always had servants. She never did anything herself more than pour out coffee and wait about the house, things also that white women would have been doing. But it's really important to note that these are activities that were not associated with Black labor. Grimm notes that she, quote, occupied the position of a white woman as much as any I ever knew. Now, to labor as the head, as the lady of the house, as a white Southern woman would, meant, yes, managing the labor of others, which also meant sometimes punishing enslaved people. This is a difficult moment, which you sometimes don't know what to do with. An enslaved woman who is herself sometimes supposedly taking the whip into her own hands. But this was something that white enslaving women did to project their own power. Now, we don't have real corroborating evidence for this. Perhaps the overseer was just angry at Rachel and wanted to tell a story about her that he thought would make her look bad, but perhaps it is true. Either way, the fact that he even would believe or thought it was believable that she could do such a thing reiterates that she had some position of power on the plantation. Acting as the mistress of the house also means, beyond managing the labor of others, that she was performing a certain kind of wifely duty. And we don't know whether or not they engaged in sex. What we do know is that they engaged in intimate activities like simply sitting down together and having a conversation, eating a meal together. That might not seem like very much, but an enslaving white man and an enslaved Black woman literally sitting at the same level, having a conversation together, was not typical. that would have been seen as an intimate act. And we get a sense of where and how and on what these intimate conversations are happening through the records. So, for instance, we have this inventory where we know that there is a sofa and 2 settees that are in the house. So perhaps they are sitting together on sofas like this, having a conversation. And we don't know what about, but just that almost everyday act of being together was a sign of intimacy. And we also know that there are other cases in Texas of an enslaved woman and an enslaving white man projecting a relationship together, in part through these intimate acts of having dinner together or sitting and having a conversation. We also know that Rachel is not just projecting this sense of power or authority or position on the plantation. She's also doing so off the plantation. Now, mobility is something that was limited intentionally for enslaved people. Many were required to carry a handwritten pass in order to move off the plantation, a pass that was written by the overseer or the enslaver. But Rachel, it seems, had a horse of her own and likely used the buggy that Columbus Patton had, let's just say, pimped out in the late 1840s. He made sure that this thing was looking real good for when she was going to be using it. And so Rachel is taking advantage of these small but important mechanisms of mobility to get her off the plantation when she wanted. It seems that she was doing so on her own, because then she's going into town and she's buying what she wants. Yes, because she is lady of the household, she's buying things for the plantation, but she was also known around town for her fashion. She was known to buy the most la mode of dresses from what was available in Columbia, in Brazoria County. She would buy fine dresses for herself. If she saw other women wearing dresses that she liked, she would go and buy those. She was trying to give a sense of who she was through her purchases. And we can get a little sense here from this receipt, which you can see at the top here is Rachel of C.R. Patton. So this is Rachel from the Patton plantation. And she is buying a lot of fashion accoutrement. So in the 1850s, 1840s, you can get a sense from these fashion plates here, more is better. And so they would take what was already potentially a fine dress, and they would add lace and bows and buttons and make that skirt bigger. You can get a sense she herself was likely taking maybe a slightly out of date dress and updating it to make sure she was at the height of fashion, even in a rural place like Brazoria County. She was giving the world a sense of who she was. She was performing her position off the plantation, because most Black women in the South were not wearing dresses like that. Their labor would not allow it. Their enslavers would not allow it. They did not have the money, the purchasing power for it. And so Rachel, walking around town, riding around town, sitting in church, was exuding who she thought she was, even against what others thought of her. And she did, in fact, sit in church. Not only did she sit in church, she sat with the white ladies. And this is a time when church is deeply segregated. Enslaved people were supposed to sit in a particular space, in the back or in the balcony. White women had a key spot at the center, at the front, and Rachel made herself known, sitting in that spot. Not only sitting, but supposedly, at least on one occasion, taking up more room than usual. Now, if we think back to how big these skirts are, you can imagine her coming in and just taking up as much space as she could. That, for me, is a kind of indication of her projecting her sense of self in this place. Now, I've talked a lot about this sense of power and authority that she had, something that most enslaved women could not feel. But it's not as if she is moving through this world without any resistance. In this same letter, we see that Rachel needs to be told, quote, which seats were intended for slaves. Just one example of so many where white citizens of Brazoria County push back against Rachel, try to put her in her place. And it's going to be Patton's own family that ends up really making that happen. Because Columbus Patton in 1854 is deemed by the courts, quote, non compos mentis. In other words, insane. Who brought such a suit? His brother, Charles Patton, who deems that he is, quote, incapable of managing his affairs. With this case, the decision is that indeed Columbus cannot manage his affairs. He's sent to an insane asylum in South Carolina. And not only does this mean that he no longer lives and works and has power over Patton Place, so too does Rachel. Rachel's fall from power happens immediately. Sarah Ford, once again, discusses this. She uses the metaphor of a bird up in the sky that has to come down at some point. A bird cannot stay flying forever. Sarah says Rachel is like that bird, and she too had to come down from her height. After Columbus is forced to the insane asylum in South Carolina, Rachel is forced from the mansion into the fields, into the slave quarter, no longer having that even small amount of authority and power over the household and over herself. Now, one interesting kind of slight reversal does happen potentially because of Rachel. In 1854, when Columbus is sent to the asylum, Charles brings this court case. There's no will to be found of Columbus Patton's. And the assumption is, well, of course, his family, his brother, his sisters, his nephew, they're the ones that will inherit this sizable estate. But in 1857, a will is found in the house. This will is brought to the court, and it tells the world that Rachel, along with another woman named Maria, are going to benefit from this legal document. They are not freed, that is an important part, but they are given the ability to determine where they live, with whom they live, and they receive what is at the time a substantial sum of $100 per year to do with what they will. That would have changed Rachel's life again. The will also goes on to completely ignore Columbus Patton's family. They are not in the will at all. And they are pissed. They are they are just aghast that this is what Columbus supposedly wanted. So they end up blaming Rachel. It's her fault that they are no longer a part of the inheritance plan. Pattons are absolutely stunned by this. They argue that Rachel was deceitful, that she was devious, that she used Columbus to extort from him something for herself while denying it to the Patton family. Now, eventually the Pattons do concede, and Rachel is supposed to receive what Columbus had wanted her to, the ability to live where she wanted, the ability to live with whom she wanted, receive that $100. And we don't know exactly where she is living immediately after this. Sarah remembers that she didn't stay in the field, and one can assume in the slave quarter, for too long, that she was put into a house by herself, and that she was able to not work. We don't know whether she stays or how long she stays in this house, because Charles, who is Columbus's brother, the one who brought the case against Columbus, moves onto the plantation in 1858. And we can say that Charles and Rachel probably didn't have a great relationship. They were a little bit tense with each other. And also, by the way, Charles has also a bachelor, also has an enslaved woman who lives with him in the house. Her name is Deanie. But Rachel may have been living on or off the plantation. We do have this scrap of evidence from 1859, which seems to suggest that she might be living with a man named Mr. Hare, James Hare. She appears on receipts purchasing goods for the Hare household in 1858, 1859. So again, perhaps she's no longer living at Patton Place and instead is living and managing the household of another white man. Whether or not she was living away from the plantation, by 1860, her life was going to change dramatically again. Because John Adriance, who is the executor of the estate, of Columbus Patton's estate, declared that she was a danger to the plantation, to the estate, that her presence was harmful, especially in terms of the enslaved people. And she needed to be removed completely, not only from the plantation, not only from Brazoria County, but from Texas altogether. She needed to be removed to Cincinnati. So she's forced to leave in 1860. And we know a little bit about what her life was like there, just the tiniest bit, because of that 1870 court case. We know that she was able to obtain her freedom papers, which is an incredible feat. But not only that, she decides, after gaining her freedom papers, to go back to the still slave state of Texas. That is a difficult choice, and one that seems to suggest that she really wanted to go to the place she called home. She goes back, John Adriance steals her freedom papers, and she is re-enslaved, put back onto the plantation, not as a free woman, as she wanted, but as a slave. She brought this case in large part because she thought John Adriance had caused incalculable pain and suffering to her life. She mentions, though, that she wants to go home. She wants to go back and build a home at Patton Place. That place is still drawing her. That connection is still strong, regardless of the fact that she had been enslaved there, re-enslaved there, meant to felt such pain there. She still felt a connection to this place. And so that's one of the many demands that she makes, that she wants to make home there. She also wants some money, very smartly. And she uses the courts to try to gain these things that she demands, to try to gain some justice. It's not the first time that she uses after emancipation, the newly available justice system to herself, to avail of herself. She goes to the Freedmen's Bureau to bring a case against a white man who assaulted her. She eventually settles, but still gains $5 from the situation. And it just reiterates that she is willing to use these new avenues available to her as a now freed woman to try to get what she feels she deserves, which is, yes, money, but also was a home. Not just a house, not just a place to rent, but someplace she call home. Now, unfortunately, she never gets back to Patton Place, as far as we can tell. Patton Place is sold out of the Patton family in 1870 to pretty much corporate affairs. In 1880, we know that she is keeping house, whether that means she is keeping another person's house or keeping her own, don't fully know. We don't know exactly where she is living in Brazoria County, but we know that she is not living on Patton Place. Interestingly, she has changed her last name to Patton. Why she would do that after living for at least a few years as Rachel Bartlett, we do not know. But any story of Patton Place, of Varner Hogg, has to include Rachel. The sources tell us so. All of those sources that you saw today, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have to ensure that this story and those of other women are not left out. I mentioned that millions of enslaved people's stories have not been told. Well, that also means that hundreds of thousands of Texas women, we don't have their stories that are being told. Their stories are deserving of being heard as much as the stories that are commonplace in Texas history. So I think we can all say to Alice Kilman, I'm sorry, but we're not going to keep Rachel's story from the world. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much. And I know that there was a class that ended at 12:20 and starts at 12:30. So thank you for those of you who are able to stay, and sorry for those who had to get to their next class and missed the very ending. Are there any questions that we have here today in our audience? And I'm going to look online and find some as well while we're getting started. Oh, I know that I was going to say, John, I'd be disappointed if you didn't have any questions. All right.
I just also want to hype John's new book,
tomorrow,
The
right?
Texas Low Country.
Yeah.
Everyone should not only buy my book, but also John's book. They pair very well together.
They do.
Our library will have both of them as well.
And
Excellent.
Library copy of This Is Our Home. You can check this out. And Dr. Lundberg's book will be there tomorrow. Well, whenever it gets there, but
Yeah.
it'll also be in the library for you to check out.
well, and Dr. Stewart was kind enough to write a blurb for the back of my book. So thank you very much. Very kind words. When do you, I get the sense that she started going by Bartlett when she was in Ohio.
Yeah.
She was in Cincinnati. So my theory, and I wanted to know what you thought about this, is that she started going by Bartlett because that's the name she chose for herself when the court freed her.
Mm-hmm.
What do you?
Yeah, why Bartlett though?
I see.
That's
I don't
what
know.
I-
That's
yeah.
I don't know. That's the. I mean, her time in Cincinnati is murky at
Mhm.
best, but it doesn't last much more than about a year before Adrian's catches up with her and coerces or steals her freedom papers and coerces her back to Texas. So
Absolutely, yeah.
she wants to go, but still.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's sometime in Ohio that she takes a surname that she decides on.
Right.
Why she decides on that particular name, we do not know. And why then she seems to revert back to Patton years later is also unknown.
Well, and I find it ironic that Charles Patton is treating her that way because he has a mistress who acts as the mistress on his plantation.
Deanie, yes.
Deanie, but her Ardenia, I found her. She because he left her $70 in gold in his will as a freed woman, and so that's because what's his name's interview with the WPA? He talks about his sister was.
Yes.
You know who I'm talking about?
And no, not Anderson. Why can't I think of
Anthony
Anthony Christopher.
Anthony Christopher, that's it. Talks about his sister was Master Charles' girl, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah. So this is something that both Patton brothers
Yep.
are doing. Though actually there are three main reasons why Columbus is deemed non compos mentis. One of them has to do with spiritualism because he was really into this interesting connection to the ghost. One is about that he was trying all these crazy agricultural. It does, and then there's references to Rachel. So it is almost like people think he is crazy in part because he is having this relationship. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So one of the questions on mine was, why was she not freed in the will? And what are your thoughts about that?
So she actually, in the 1870 court case, it's interesting because she says that Columbus did everything in his power to pretty much free her without freeing her. The laws in Texas are shifting pretty dramatically in the late antebellum era, and it becomes very, very, very difficult to manumit anyone in Texas. There's also a potential way of looking at it that Columbus, I mean, this is what enslavers say, that they are better off, that an enslaved person is better off under their care than potentially off in freedom elsewhere. Now that's Columbus's perspective, not Rachel's. But it is a legal fact that it was difficult to almost impossible to manumit people. And that was by, they did that on purpose, the legislature, right? The legislature created laws, they built the Constitution in a way to embed slavery firmly within the state and to make it really, really difficult to free anyone because they wanted to maintain the institution of slavery as a core part of Texas. It's a great question, though.
What are your next steps or hopes of working with the former Patton Plantation and kind of making sure that all your work goes into what they're doing and what they have on display?
Yeah, so the staff at Varner Hogg Plantation site has been doing absolutely incredible work for the past decade or so. The state, the Texas Historical Commission, owns the site and thus has purview over what happens. But the site staff who are working there know what the best practices of public history are. They know the most recent scholarship, and they are absolutely dedicated to ensuring that not only Rachel's story, but the story of enslaved people, of convict laborers, of Black cowboys and oil workers, of those whose story has been left out from the moment when Ima Hogg created her narrative of Texas history, really until like 2 decades ago, were left out. And they are dedicated to making sure that story is told, even when there is pushback from the upper echelon of administration at the Texas Historical Commission or outside forces who are coming in and arguing that what they're doing is not, quote, accurate Texas history, when in fact this is real, honest Texas history, that these stories have to be told if we're going to get a sense of what this place, the past of this place actually was. So I know myself, and I think John is also going to be doing a conversation with site staff there, open to the public. That's coming. Mine is in May. I think yours will be in the summer. So keep an eye out for that. And then, I mean, both of our books, they are adamant of having them in the bookshop for both that plantation and the other plantation that they own, Levi Jordan. And they are really making sure that they're doing the work and doing it well. Again, even when they're getting really harsh and unfair pushback from outside. Yes. Yes. Yes, which was essential. If you don't know, there was a little bit of a difficulty a few months ago with the site pulling books. most of which were written by Black scholars, and which supposedly did not have anything to do with the plantation, but had something to do with slavery, or racism. So in fact, they do very much relate to what was happening at the site in the past and what they're doing in the present in terms of public history. But that has been rectified, thankfully, and the historians and journalists and the site staff have been working hard to make sure that this fuller story is being told.
So as we're kind of wrapping up in here, I think we've lost most of our students to the next class, but what can you tell us a little bit about your next project? What's next? What stories are you still looking at? One of our questions was like, how do you decide what stories to focus on? And I love that question, but also what's your next step?
Yeah, and I do want to know one of the things that historians do is make choices. We're always making choices. What is the time frame that we're looking at? What is the geographical boundaries of what we're looking at? Who do we focus on? Who do we leave out? Those are all choices, and we need to be upfront with our readers about why we're making the decisions that we are, and not just make assumptions about what's important or not. Let's be open with our readers and with the public about what historians actually do, the choices we make, why we make these choices, etc. So I just want to make a note of that. There is no such thing as like the history, because it will never include everything. We have to make these choices because we're also storytellers. We like to tell stories. So there are two books that I'm working on right now. The first I mentioned at the beginning is a long history of Varner Hogg Plantation from indigenous homeland to contemporary public history site. And it really is a way of me trying to think through how we do history in Texas, of what choices we make, of who gets to be included, whose stories are left out. And it's going to, in some ways, center on Ima Hogg and her choices, but it's going to go back and forth in time, thinking about what's actually happening in the 19th century and then how it's being told in the 20th and then now in the 21st century. And my other book project, which I will be on fellowship at Mount Vernon and at Monticello next year, is a history of the relationship between wine and slavery in the United States. And it's going to start with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and their attempts to make wine the next great slave-made cash crop. But then it's going to move across the country down to South Carolina, over to Ohio, into Alabama, Texas, California, because across the 19th century, enslavers are thinking about how this particular kind of crop, of course, one that many of them loved to drink, could actually be a way of growing and solidifying the institution when it was on rough soil. Indeed. Yeah, I thought it was whiskey or rum. Rum. Yeah, it's the first alcohol supposedly ever made in Texas on the Varner Hogg Plantation. So anyways, next time I come, we'll have a wine tasting to go with the talk. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and please keep, if you're online, thank you for joining us today, and please keep updated for all of our future online events. I know that this summer, Dr. Lundberg and I are going to do a 250th anniversary of 1774 for the 4th of July, so keep a lookout on that. We have a Juneteenth event coming up as well, so we will keep you all posted for that. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.